July 21st, 1969. Shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning, Moscow time, the Soviet deep space tracking facility at Yevpatoria on the western coast of the Crimean Peninsula. In a control room dominated by banks of analog instruments and the slow rotation of an enormous parabolic antenna outside, a senior engineer of the Soviet Space Tracking Service sat before a console that had spent the previous several days doing something the Soviet government had never publicly acknowledged. It had been tracking the American Apollo 11 mission across the entire distance between the Earth and the Moon. The engineer had not slept. He had been monitoring the telemetry, the radio transmissions, and the trajectory data of the spacecraft that, a few hours earlier, had landed 2 American astronauts on the surface of the Moon. The Soviet Union had every reason in the world to want what the engineer was watching to be a lie. 13 days earlier, on July 3rd, the Soviet N-1 lunar rocket had exploded on its launch pad at Baikonur in one of the largest non-nuclear detonations in history, ending any realistic Soviet hope of reaching the Moon. The Soviet space program, which had dominated the early years of the space race with an unbroken string of firsts, had just been defeated in the most public and humiliating manner possible. The Americans had reached the Moon. The Soviets had not. For the propaganda apparatus of the Soviet state, there was only one thing that could possibly salvage the situation. If the American landing could be shown to be a fabrication, a staged spectacle filmed in a studio, then the American victory would collapse into the greatest fraud in the history of the Cold War, and the Soviet defeat would become a Soviet triumph. The engineers and intelligence officers monitoring Apollo 11 from Yevpatoria understood this implicit hope. No formal order had been issued instructing them to find evidence of American fraud. No such order was necessary. Every man in that control room understood that if the Soviet tracking network could produce any data demonstrating that the Americans had not actually gone to the Moon, that data would be the most valuable intelligence product the Soviet Union could possibly acquire. The men at Yevpatoria were the most motivated skeptics on the planet. They wanted the landing to be fake. Their nation needed it to be fake. And they possessed the most sophisticated equipment outside the United States for determining whether it was fake. What the engineer at the Yevpatoria console did not yet fully accept, as he reviewed the trajectory data in the early hours of July 21st, was that the same equipment that could have exposed an American fraud was instead confirming, measurement by measurement, that no fraud had occurred. The Soviet tracking network had followed the Apollo 11 spacecraft from Earth orbit, across the translunar coast, into lunar orbit, and down to the surface. The radio signals had come from the Moon. The trajectory had matched the physics of an actual lunar mission. The signals had originated from the lunar surface, 240,000 miles away, exactly where the Americans said their astronauts were standing. The Soviet Union, the one nation on Earth with both the capability and the overwhelming motivation to expose an American lie, had instead gathered the most authoritative independent confirmation that the American achievement was real. The enemy who most wanted it to be fake had become the witness who proved it was true. To understand why Soviet confirmation of the Apollo 11 landing carries the evidentiary weight that it does, it is necessary to understand the depth of the Soviet motivation to disprove it. In July 1969, the Soviet Union stood at the lowest point of its position in the space race. For 12 years, beginning with the launch of Sputnik in October 1957, the Soviet space program had dominated the competition with the United States. The Soviets had launched the first satellite, the first living creature into orbit, the first man into space, the first woman, the first spacewalk. Each of these achievements had been celebrated by the Soviet propaganda apparatus as proof of the superiority of the socialist system over the capitalist system of the United States. The space race had been, for the Soviet Union, not merely a technological competition, but an ideological one. Soviet success in space was presented to the world and to the Soviet population as evidence that communism represented the future of human civilization. The American landing on the moon shattered this narrative completely. The single most ambitious objective of the entire space age, the objective that both superpowers had identified as the decisive prize, had been achieved by the United States, while the Soviet Union had failed even to launch a functioning lunar rocket. The propaganda damage to the Soviet Union was immense. The nation that had spent 12 years telling the world that socialism was winning the space race had now lost the race at its most important moment. The Soviet leadership understood the magnitude of the defeat. Soviet television did not broadcast the lunar landing live, and the Soviet press treated the American achievement with deliberate understatement. The Soviet population was not encouraged to dwell on the fact that the Americans had reached the moon. Against this background, the possibility that the American landing might be a fabrication represented the only conceivable path by which the Soviet Union could convert its catastrophic defeat into a propaganda victory. If the Soviets could demonstrate that the Americans had faked the landing, the consequences would be world-altering. The United States would be exposed as having perpetrated the most elaborate fraud in human history. American credibility on every front of the Cold War would collapse. The Soviet Union, which had genuinely launched satellites and cosmonauts that the entire world had tracked and verified, would stand vindicated as the only superpower that had actually accomplished what it claimed in space. The propaganda value of exposing an American lunar fraud would have exceeded the propaganda value of any Soviet space achievement, including the launch of Gagarin himself. This was the prize that the Soviet tracking network was implicitly tasked with pursuing in July 1969. The Soviet Union did not need to be told to look for evidence of American fraud. The institutional incentive was overwhelming and obvious. Any Soviet scientist who could produce credible evidence that the Apollo landing was staged would have become a hero of the Soviet Union. Any Soviet intelligence officer who could document the fraud would have secured his career for life. The combination of national humiliation, ideological necessity, and personal incentive created the most powerful motivation to disprove the lunar landing that has ever existed anywhere. And the Soviet Union possessed, in its deep space tracking network, the technical means to act on that motivation. If the landing could be disproven, the Soviets were the people who could do it, and July 1969 was the moment they had every reason to try. The evidentiary weight of Soviet confirmation rests not only on Soviet motivation, but on Soviet capability. For the Soviet endorsement of the Apollo landing to mean anything, the Soviet Union had to possess the technical means to independently verify or disprove the American claim. It did. By 1969, the Soviet Union operated one of the two most sophisticated deep space tracking networks on Earth, second only to the American network it was designed to monitor. This network had been built over more than a decade specifically to support the Soviet space program, and it was fully capable of tracking spacecraft across the entire distance between the Earth and the Moon. The centerpiece of the Soviet tracking network was the Deep Space Communications Complex at Yevpatoria in the Crimea, which had been constructed beginning in 1960 for the purpose of communicating with Soviet lunar and planetary probes. The Yevpatoria facility operated enormous parabolic antennas, including a system built from 8 separate 16-meter dishes mounted on the rotating superstructure of a converted naval gun turret, capable of receiving signals from spacecraft hundreds of thousands of kilometers from Earth. The facility had been used to communicate with the Soviet Luna probes, the Venera missions to Venus, and the Mars probes. It was a facility designed to detect and decode faint radio signals originating from the vicinity of other celestial bodies. A signal originating from the surface of the Moon was precisely the kind of signal the Yevpatoria complex had been built to receive. In addition to the fixed facility at Yevpatoria, the Soviet Union operated a fleet of specialized tracking ships that could be positioned anywhere in the world's oceans to monitor spacecraft during the phases of a mission when they were not visible from Soviet territory. The flagship of this fleet, the Kosmonavt Yuri Gagarin, was one of the largest research vessels ever built, displacing 45,000 tons and carrying 4 large parabolic antennas, along with a crew of scientists and technicians whose function was to track spacecraft and receive their telemetry. Smaller tracking ships, including the Kosmonavt Vladimir Komarov, supplemented the fleet. These vessels gave the Soviet Union the ability to monitor spacecraft across the full circumference of the Earth, eliminating the gaps in coverage that a network of fixed ground stations would have created. During the Apollo 11 mission, Soviet tracking ships were positioned in the Atlantic and other ocean areas, monitoring the American spacecraft during the phases when it passed beyond the range of the Yevpatoria facility. The radio frequencies on which Apollo 11 transmitted were not secret. The technical parameters of the Apollo communication system had been published, and the transmissions themselves were broadcast openly, both because the volume of communication required by a lunar mission made encryption impractical and because the United States had nothing to hide. This openness meant that the Soviet tracking network could receive and decode the Apollo transmissions directly. Soviet scientists at Yevpatoria listened to the same communications between the astronauts and mission control in Houston that the American networks were broadcasting to the world, and they did so by receiving the signals directly from the spacecraft rather than by monitoring American broadcasts. This distinction matters enormously. The Soviets were not watching American television coverage. They were receiving the original radio signals, measuring the direction from which those signals arrived, and calculating the distance to their source. The capability to measure the direction and distance of a radio signal was the capability that made Soviet verification decisive. A faked lunar landing, filmed in a studio on Earth, would have produced radio signals originating from a location on the surface of the Earth. A genuine lunar landing would produce radio signals originating from the surface of the Moon, 240,000 miles away. These two scenarios are not difficult to distinguish for a tracking network equipped to measure signal direction and to calculate the time delay of radio transmissions. A signal traveling from the Moon to the Earth requires approximately 1¼ seconds to make the journey, a delay that is directly measurable and that corresponds to a specific distance. A signal originating from a terrestrial studio would exhibit no such delay. The Soviet network measured the delay. The Soviet network measured the direction. Both measurements indicated that the signals were originating from the Moon. Furthermore, the Soviet network tracked the Apollo 11 spacecraft throughout its trajectory, not merely during the landing itself. The Soviets observed the spacecraft accelerate out of Earth orbit onto the translunar trajectory. They tracked it across the Gulf to the Moon. They observed it enter lunar orbit. They tracked the lunar module's descent to the surface. Each phase of this trajectory was consistent with the physics of an actual lunar mission and could not have been faked without the Soviets detecting the discrepancy. A fabricated mission would have required the Americans to somehow place a transmitting object on an actual lunar trajectory while keeping the astronauts on Earth, a deception that would itself have required most of the technology that going to the Moon required, and that the Soviet tracking network would have been positioned to detect. The Soviets did not detect any such deception because there was none to detect. The trajectory the Soviets tracked was the trajectory of 3 men going to the Moon. The Soviet interception of the Apollo 11 mission began at the moment of launch on July 16, 1969, and continued without interruption through the splashdown 8 days later. The Soviet tracking network treated the American mission as the highest priority intelligence target available, which it was. Every Soviet asset capable of monitoring a mission was directed toward it. The Yevpatoria complex tracked the spacecraft whenever it was above the Soviet horizon. The tracking ships covered the gaps. Soviet scientists and intelligence officers recorded the telemetry, decoded the transmissions, and computed the trajectory in parallel with their American counterparts, working from the raw radio signals rather than from any American-provided information. The phase of the mission that the Soviets monitored with the most intense scrutiny was the lunar landing itself on July 20th. This was the phase at which a fabrication, had there been one, would have been most likely to reveal itself. If the Americans had been transmitting from a terrestrial location while claiming to be on the moon, the discrepancy between the claimed position and the actual position of the transmitter would have been most detectable during the period when the astronauts were ostensibly on the lunar surface conducting their activities. The Soviet network focused its attention on this phase. The results were unambiguous. The radio signals carrying the voices of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin during their activities on the lunar surface arrived at the Soviet tracking stations with the time delay characteristic of a signal that had traveled from the moon. The round-trip delay of a radio signal between the Earth and the Moon is approximately 2.5 seconds, the time required for a signal to travel to the Moon and for the response to return. This delay was audible in the recorded conversations between the astronauts in Houston, and it was precisely measurable by the Soviet equipment. The delay corresponded to the distance of the Moon. It did not correspond to any terrestrial location. A signal from a studio on Earth would have arrived effectively instantaneously. The signals from Apollo 11 did not. They arrived late, by exactly the amount that a lunar origin required. The directional measurements reinforced the timing measurements. The Soviet antennas, in tracking the source of the Apollo transmissions, pointed at the Moon. As the Moon moved across the sky, the Soviet antennas tracked it, following the source of the signals along the precise path that the Moon followed through the sky. A terrestrial transmitter would not have moved with the Moon. It would have remained at a fixed terrestrial location, or it would have moved across the sky along a different path. The Apollo signals came from the Moon, and the Soviet antennas, in following them, traced the motion of the Moon itself. The trajectory data accumulated across the full duration of the mission provided the final layer of confirmation. The Soviet network had tracked the Apollo spacecraft through every phase of its journey, and the trajectory it had measured was internally consistent and physically correct at every point. The spacecraft had accelerated to escape velocity at the correct moment. It had coasted to the Moon along the correct path. It had entered lunar orbit at the correct time and at the correct velocity. The lunar module had descended to the surface and, later, ascended from it. The command module had departed lunar orbit and returned to Earth. Each of these maneuvers had occurred at the time and in the manner that an actual lunar mission required, and the Soviet network had observed each of them independently. The trajectory could not have been faked, because faking it would have required placing actual objects on actual lunar trajectories, which is to say, it would have required doing most of what going to the Moon required. The scientists at Yevpatoria, monitoring this accumulation of evidence in real time, reached the conclusion that their data forced upon them. The Americans had gone to the Moon. There was no fraud to expose. The signals came from the lunar surface. The trajectory was genuine. The astronauts were where the Americans said they were. For the Soviet scientists, this was not the conclusion they had hoped to reach. It was the conclusion that their instruments compelled them to reach. The men who had been positioned to expose the greatest fraud in history had instead documented the authenticity of the greatest achievement in history. Their own equipment had betrayed their own hopes. There is a particular psychological quality to the position these Soviet scientists occupied, and it is the quality that gives their conclusion its evidentiary force. A friendly witness who confirms a claim may be suspected of bias in favor of the claim. A neutral witness who confirms a claim carries more weight. But a hostile witness, a witness who desperately wanted the claim to be false, who possessed every motivation to disprove it, and who had the technical means to disprove it if it were false, and who nonetheless concluded that the claim was true, carries the greatest evidentiary weight of all. The Soviet scientists at Yevpatoria were hostile witnesses of the most extreme kind. They wanted the landing to be fake. They were equipped to prove it was fake, and they concluded that it was real. There is no more credible form of confirmation than the reluctant confirmation of a determined adversary. The real-time tracking data gathered by the Soviet network during the mission itself was only the first layer of independent confirmation that accumulated in the years following Apollo 11. The American astronauts had left physical hardware on the lunar surface, and some of that hardware was specifically designed to permit independent verification of the landing by any nation on Earth that possessed the technology to use it. The most important of these instruments was the laser retroreflector. During their activities on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin deployed a device called the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector, a panel of corner cube reflectors designed to reflect a laser beam directly back toward its source. The principle of a corner cube reflector is that it returns light along the exact path from which the light arrived, regardless of the angle at which the light strikes it. A laser beam fired from an observatory on Earth, aimed at the location where Apollo 11 had landed, would strike the retroreflector and be reflected directly back to the observatory. By measuring the time required for the laser pulse to travel to the Moon and return, scientists could measure the distance to the Moon with extraordinary precision, and, more importantly for our purposes, they could confirm that a human-made reflector existed at the exact location where the Americans claimed to have landed. The significance of the retroreflector as evidence is that it permitted any nation with the appropriate laser and telescope technology to independently verify that American equipment was sitting on the lunar surface at the claimed landing site. This was not a verification that depended on trusting American data. It was a verification that any sufficiently advanced nation could perform for itself. Observatories around the world, including observatories in the Soviet Union and in nations aligned with the Soviet Union, were able to bounce laser beams off the Apollo retroreflectors. The reflectors were there. They reflected the lasers. They sat at the locations where the Americans said the landings had occurred. No studio on Earth could produce a reflector on the Moon. The retroreflector was physical, permanent, and independently verifiable, and it remains so today. More than half a century after Apollo 11, observatories continue to bounce lasers off the retroreflectors left by the Apollo missions, and the measurements continue to confirm the locations of the landings. The second major category of physical evidence was the lunar material returned by the missions. Apollo 11 brought back approximately 21 kilograms of lunar rock and soil. The subsequent Apollo missions returned hundreds of kilograms more. This material was distributed to scientific institutions around the world for analysis, and the analysis revealed characteristics that could not have been produced by any terrestrial source. The lunar samples contained minerals formed under conditions that do not exist on Earth, including the complete absence of water in their formation, and the presence of isotope ratios characteristic of exposure to the solar wind and cosmic radiation over billions of years on a body without an atmosphere or magnetic field. The samples could not have been manufactured. They could not have been collected from any terrestrial location. They were lunar, and their lunar origin was verifiable by any competent geochemistry laboratory. The Soviet Union was in a uniquely strong position to evaluate the authenticity of the American lunar samples, because the Soviet Union possessed lunar samples of its own. The Soviet robotic Luna probes, which the Soviet space program had developed as its alternative to crewed lunar exploration, had returned small quantities of lunar material to Earth through automated sample return missions. The Luna 16 mission in 1970 returned approximately 100 grams of lunar soil. Subsequent Luna missions returned additional material. This meant that Soviet scientists possessed genuine lunar samples, collected by their own robotic spacecraft, against which they could compare the American samples. In 1971, and again in subsequent years, the United States and the Soviet Union exchanged lunar samples for scientific study. Soviet scientists examined American lunar material. American scientists examined Soviet lunar material. The materials were consistent with each other. Both were genuinely lunar. The Soviet scientists who examined the American samples were comparing them against the standard of their own independently collected lunar material, and the American samples passed the comparison. This exchange of samples is one of the most overlooked pieces of evidence in the entire question of the lunar landing's authenticity. The Soviet Union, the adversary that would have gained the most from exposing American samples as terrestrial fakes, examined those samples directly, compared them against genuine lunar material that the Soviets had collected themselves, and found them authentic. Had the American samples been terrestrial rocks dressed up as lunar material, the Soviet scientists who possessed real lunar samples would have detected the difference immediately, and the propaganda victory of exposing the fraud would have been theirs for the taking. The Soviets examined the samples. The Soviets found them genuine. The Soviets said nothing to contradict the American claim, because there was nothing to contradict. The accumulation of independently verifiable physical evidence, from the retroreflectors to the samples, made the position of the determined skeptic progressively more impossible to maintain. The Soviet response to the Apollo 11 landing exposed a tension that existed within the Soviet system between two distinct institutions with opposing interests. On one side stood the Soviet scientific and engineering establishment, the men who tracked the spacecraft, analyzed the samples, and understood the physics of spaceflight. On the other side stood the Soviet propaganda apparatus, the institutions responsible for managing the information that reached the Soviet public and the world. These two institutions had different relationships to the truth of the lunar landing, and the manner in which their conflict resolved tells us something important about the limits of even the most controlled information environment. The Soviet scientists knew that the landing was real. They had no doubt about it because they had tracked the mission with their own equipment and had reached the only conclusion their data permitted. For the Soviet scientific establishment, the authenticity of Apollo 11 was not a matter of opinion or propaganda. It was a measured fact. The scientists who worked at Yevpatoria, the engineers who designed the Soviet lunar program, and the geochemists who analyzed the lunar samples, all operated within a professional culture that, whatever its political constraints, was grounded in physical reality. A rocket either reached the moon or it did not. A radio signal either came from the lunar surface or it did not. A sample was either lunar or it was terrestrial. These were not questions that could be resolved by ideology. They were questions resolved by measurement, and the measurements had been taken. The Soviet propaganda apparatus operated under different constraints and different incentives. Its function was to manage the political meaning of events for the benefit of the Soviet state. From the propaganda perspective, the ideal response to Apollo 11 would have been to discredit it, and if discrediting it had been possible, the propaganda apparatus would have done so without hesitation. The Soviet propaganda system had demonstrated, repeatedly and across decades, that it was entirely willing to lie about matters of fact when lying served the interests of the state. The concealment of the Nedelin disaster, in which the Soviet state hid the deaths of 126 people for 29 years, demonstrated the capacity of the Soviet propaganda apparatus for sustained deception about even the largest events. The Soviet propaganda system was not constrained by any general commitment to truth. If it could have plausibly claimed that Apollo 11 was faked, the historical record of Soviet behavior suggests that it would have made the claim. The reason the Soviet propaganda apparatus did not claim that Apollo 11 was faked is the central fact of this story, and it is a fact about the difference between deceptions that can be sustained and deceptions that cannot. The Nedelin disaster could be concealed because the only people who possessed direct evidence of it were Soviet citizens whom the Soviet state could control. The witnesses were Soviet. The physical site was on Soviet territory. The documentation was in Soviet archives. The Soviet state could suppress the information because the Soviet state controlled all of the channels through which the information might escape. Concealing Nedelin required only that the Soviet state maintain silence and prevent its own citizens from speaking, which the apparatus of a totalitarian state was well equipped to accomplish. Claiming that Apollo 11 was faked would have required something entirely different. It would have required the Soviet state to make a positive assertion that contradicted physical evidence available to the entire world. The retroreflectors were on the moon, reflecting lasers fired by observatories in many nations. The lunar samples were in laboratories around the world, being analyzed by scientists who could verify their lunar origin. The trajectory had been tracked by multiple nations. For the Soviet Union to claim that the landing was faked, it would have had to assert a falsehood that any competent scientist anywhere could disprove, including the Soviet Union's own scientists, who knew the assertion was false, and who would have had to either lie publicly or remain silent. The deception could not be sustained, because the evidence against it was distributed across the entire planet, and was independently verifiable by anyone with the relevant equipment. The Soviet leadership understood this. To claim that Apollo 11 was faked would not have damaged the United States. It would have damaged the Soviet Union by demonstrating that the Soviet state was willing to make scientific claims so obviously false that they exposed Soviet propaganda as detached from reality. The Soviet scientists would have known the claim was false. The international scientific community would have known the claim was false. The claim would have made the Soviet Union look not merely defeated, but foolish. A nation so unable to accept its defeat that it resorted to transparently absurd denials. The propagandists, for once, were overruled by the simple impossibility of the lie they would have needed to tell. The scientists had measured reality, and reality could not be propagandized away. The Soviet Union accepted in silence that the Americans had reached the moon, because the alternative was a lie that would have humiliated the Soviet Union more than the defeat itself. The most powerful evidence for the authenticity of the Apollo landings is not any single measurement or sample. It is a pattern of behavior that extended across more than 2 decades, the pattern of what the Soviet Union did not do. From July 1969 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, across 22 years of continued Cold War hostility, the Soviet Union never once claimed that the American lunar landings were faked. This silence, maintained across more than 2 decades by the adversary with the greatest possible motivation to break it, constitutes the single most compelling argument against the conspiracy theories that would later emerge. To appreciate the weight of this silence, it is necessary to understand how aggressively the Soviet Union exploited every other opportunity for anti-American propaganda during the same period. The Soviet propaganda apparatus was relentless, sophisticated, and entirely willing to promote false or distorted claims when they served Soviet interests. The Soviet Union ran sustained disinformation campaigns throughout the Cold War. It promoted the false claim that the United States had created the AIDS virus as a biological weapon, a fabrication that Soviet intelligence deliberately seeded into the international press during the 1980s. It amplified every genuine American failure and manufactured American failures where none existed. The Soviet propaganda machine was one of the most capable instruments of state deception ever constructed, and it operated continuously against the United States for the entire duration of the Cold War. This same propaganda machine, which was willing to fabricate the claim that America had invented AIDS, never fabricated the claim that America had faked the moon landing. The contrast is stark and revealing. The AIDS disinformation was a lie that the Soviets manufactured from nothing because it served their interests and could not be definitively disproven in the public mind. The moon landing fraud would have been a lie that served Soviet interests even more powerfully, but the Soviets did not manufacture it, because it could be definitively disproven by anyone, including by the Soviets themselves. The Soviet propaganda apparatus was constrained not by honesty, but by feasibility. It told the lies it could sustain and avoided the lies it could not. The moon landing fraud was a lie it could not sustain, because the evidence against it was physical, distributed worldwide, and independently verifiable. The opportunities the Soviet Union passed up were numerous and significant. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated sharply at several points during the years following Apollo 11. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 triggered a collapse in relations and an American boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 introduced an American administration that openly described the Soviet Union as an evil empire and that pursued a military buildup explicitly designed to defeat the Soviet system. The deployment of American missiles in Europe in the early 1980s produced the most dangerous period of Cold War tension since the Cuban Missile Crisis. At each of these moments, the Soviet propaganda apparatus was operating at full intensity, seeking every available means to discredit the United States and to undermine American prestige. At none of these moments did the Soviet Union claim that the Apollo landings were faked. The accusation was available. It would have been devastatingly effective if it could have been made credible. An authoritative Soviet declaration that the American lunar landings had been a Hollywood fabrication, backed by the apparent authority of the Soviet space program, would have been a propaganda weapon of immense power, capable of undermining American credibility across the entire range of Cold War competition. The Soviet Union never deployed this weapon, across 22 years and multiple periods of acute hostility, for one reason: the weapon did not exist. There was no fraud to expose, and the Soviet Union, which had tracked the missions and analyzed the samples, knew there was no fraud to expose. To have claimed otherwise would have required the Soviet Union to assert a falsehood that its own scientists knew to be false, and that the international scientific community could disprove. The silence of the Soviet Union on this question is, in a sense, the verdict of history's most qualified and most hostile jury. The jurors wanted to convict. They had every incentive to convict. They possessed the evidence and the expertise to render a verdict. And they acquitted, not by formal declaration, but by the more eloquent testimony of their refusal to accuse. When the conspiracy theories about the moon landing eventually emerged, they emerged not from the Soviet Union, which had tracked the missions and had every reason to expose them as fraudulent, but from American writers operating in the absence of any technical evidence whatsoever. The nation that could have proven the fraud, if a fraud had existed, never claimed one had occurred. The accusation came instead from people who possessed none of the Soviet Union's tracking data, none of its lunar samples, and none of its overwhelming motivation to find the truth. The most qualified skeptics on Earth had already reached their verdict, and their verdict was that the Americans had gone to the moon. The Soviet confirmation of the Apollo 11 landing took several forms, ranging from the formal and public to the private and professional. None of these confirmations was as loud or as celebratory as the acknowledgments offered by neutral nations or by American allies, because the Soviet Union had no interest in amplifying the achievement of its rival. But the confirmations were real, and taken together, they constitute an unambiguous Soviet acknowledgement that the Americans had reached the moon. The most immediate confirmation came in the form of official Soviet acknowledgement of the landing as a real event. The Soviet news agency TASS reported the landing as factual. The Soviet government did not dispute that it had occurred. Soviet officials, while declining to treat the American achievement as the world historical triumph that most of the world recognized it to be, never suggested that the achievement was fraudulent. The official Soviet position, from the first hours after the landing, was that the Americans had landed on the moon. This position was maintained consistently and was never contradicted by any official Soviet statement at any point in the subsequent history of the Soviet Union. The Soviet scientific establishment offered confirmation of a more substantive kind. The Soviet Academy of Sciences treated the Apollo missions as legitimate scientific achievements that produced legitimate scientific data. Soviet scientists participated in the international scientific community's analysis of the Apollo results. When the United States and the Soviet Union exchanged lunar samples, the exchange was conducted as a transaction between two nations that both possessed genuine lunar material. The Soviet scientists who received and analyzed the American samples published their analyses in the scientific literature, and those analyses treated the American samples as authentic lunar material, because that is what the analyses showed them to be. A Soviet scientific establishment that believed the American samples to be terrestrial fakes would not have published analyses confirming their lunar origin. The Soviet scientists published such analyses because the samples were genuinely lunar, and Soviet science, whatever its political constraints, did not falsify the geochemistry of rocks. Individual Soviet figures associated with the space program offered confirmation in their statements and later in their memoirs. The cosmonauts, the engineers, and the scientists who had competed against the American program understood better than anyone the magnitude of what the Americans had accomplished, and in their professional assessments, they acknowledged it. Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut who had performed the first spacewalk and who had been training to command a Soviet lunar mission, never expressed the slightest doubt about the reality of the American landings. In his memoirs and interviews, Leonov treated Apollo 11 as the genuine achievement that it was, an achievement he had personally hoped to accomplish for the Soviet Union, and that the Americans had accomplished first. The Soviet space community did not entertain conspiracy theories about the American landings, because the Soviet space community possessed the technical knowledge to know that the landings were real, and possessed the professional respect to acknowledge a rival's genuine achievement. The confirmation that closes the circle of this account is the confirmation that emerged from the Soviet tracking network itself, the network whose engineers had monitored Apollo 11 in the hope of finding evidence of fraud. The engineers at Yevpatoria and the analysts who reviewed their data reached and reported the conclusion that their measurements compelled. The signals had come from the moon. The trajectory had been genuine. The Americans had landed. This conclusion was transmitted upward through the Soviet system, where it became the basis for the Soviet leadership's decision not to contest the landing. The decision not to claim fraud was not a decision made in ignorance of the facts. It was a decision made in full knowledge of the facts, on the basis of the Soviet Union's own measurements, which had confirmed the American achievement beyond the possibility of doubt. There is a documented detail that captures the Soviet confirmation with particular clarity. In the years following the landing, Soviet scientists and officials who discussed the Apollo program privately and professionally treated its reality as simply established. The question of whether the landings had occurred was not, within the Soviet space community, a question at all. It was a settled fact, settled by the Soviet Union's own tracking data. The Soviet engineers who had hoped to find a fraud had instead become, through the integrity of their own measurements, witnesses to the authenticity of the American triumph. The officer at the Yevpatoria console who had searched for the crack in the American story had found, instead, the confirmation that no crack existed. He and his colleagues had done their work honestly, and their honest work had produced the conclusion they least wanted and most trusted, the conclusion that the enemy had genuinely reached the moon. This is the resolution of the situation established at the opening of this account. The Soviet Union, the adversary that needed the landing to be fake, that was motivated beyond any other party to prove it was fake, and that possessed the technical means to prove it if it had been fake, examined the evidence with its own instruments and confirmed that the landing was real. The most hostile witness available rendered the most credible verdict possible. The Americans had gone to the moon, and the Soviet Union, in the silence of its refusal to deny it, had confirmed it. The conspiracy theory holding that the Apollo moon landings were fabricated did not originate in the Soviet Union. This fact is one of the great ironies of the entire subject, and it deserves careful attention, because it inverts the expectation that any reasonable observer would have formed. The nation that possessed every motivation to allege a fraud, that had tracked the missions with its own equipment, and that would have reaped an enormous propaganda advantage from a credible accusation, never made one. The conspiracy theory was instead born in the United States, the nation that had actually accomplished the landings, and it was propagated by American citizens who possessed none of the technical evidence that the Soviet Union had gathered and who were operating against the interests of their own country. The origin of the modern moon landing conspiracy theory is conventionally traced to a self-published book that appeared in 1976, 7 years after Apollo 11 and 4 years after the final Apollo landing. The book was titled "We Never Went to the Moon," and its author was Bill Kaysing, a former employee of Rocketdyne, the company that had manufactured the F-1 engines for the Saturn V rocket. Kaysing had worked at Rocketdyne in a clerical and technical writing capacity in the late 1950s and early 1960s, before the Apollo program reached its operational phase, and he possessed no specialized knowledge of the systems that had carried the astronauts to the moon. His book asserted, without technical evidence, that the United States had lacked the capability to land men on the moon, and had therefore staged the landings on Earth, filming them in a remote location to deceive the world. The claims advanced by Kaysing and by the conspiracy theorists who followed him rested on a set of arguments that were almost entirely visual and almost entirely founded on misunderstandings of the physics of the lunar environment. The conspiracy theorists pointed to the absence of stars in the photographs taken on the lunar surface, not understanding that the cameras had been set to exposures appropriate for the brightly sunlit surface, which rendered the far dimmer stars invisible. They pointed to the apparent waving of the American flag, not understanding that the flag had been deliberately fitted with a horizontal rod to hold it extended in the absence of an atmosphere, and that the apparent motion was the residual swaying of the rod after the astronauts had handled it. They pointed to shadows that appeared to fall in different directions, not understanding the effects of the uneven lunar terrain and the wide-angle camera lenses on the appearance of shadows. Each of the arguments dissolved upon technical examination. Not one of them constituted evidence of the kind that the Soviet tracking network had been positioned to gather, and not one of them survived contact with the physics of an airless, low-gravity environment illuminated by a single intense light source. The fundamental asymmetry of the conspiracy theory is the asymmetry between the evidence available to its proponents and the evidence available to the party that never proposed it. The American conspiracy theorists possessed photographs, which they misinterpreted, and a general intuition that the achievement seemed too difficult to be real. They possessed no tracking data. They possessed no lunar samples. They possessed no ability to measure the origin of the radio transmissions. They possessed no laser ranging measurements. They possessed, in short, none of the physical evidence by which the authenticity of the landings could actually be evaluated. The Soviet Union possessed all of it. The party with all of the evidence concluded that the landings were real. The party with none of the evidence concluded that they were fake. The conspiracy theory was, from its origin, an argument advanced by the least qualified observers against the conclusion of the most qualified ones. The persistence of the conspiracy theory in subsequent decades, despite its complete lack of technical foundation, reflects factors that have little to do with the actual evidence. The theory appeals to a general suspicion of governments and institutions. It appeals to the intuition that an achievement so extraordinary must conceal some deception. It appeals to the desire to possess secret knowledge that the credulous masses lack. None of these appeals depends on evidence, and the theory has consequently proven resistant to the overwhelming evidence against it. But the historical fact remains that the theory was an American invention, propagated by Americans against an American achievement, in defiance of the conclusion that America's own adversary had reached on the basis of far better evidence. The Soviet Union, watching the emergence of the American conspiracy theory in the 1970s and 1980s, did not embrace it. A Soviet propaganda apparatus genuinely cynical and opportunistic might have been expected to amplify the American conspiracy theory, to promote it through Soviet media, to use the spectacle of Americans doubting their own achievement as a weapon against American prestige. The Soviet Union did not do this in any significant way, and the reason returns us to the central fact of this account. The Soviet Union knew the landings were real. To promote a theory that the Soviet space community knew to be false would have required the Soviet scientific establishment to endorse a falsehood that its own measurements contradicted. Even the cynicism of Soviet propaganda had limits, and those limits were defined by the physical evidence that the Soviet Union itself had gathered. The Americans had gone to the moon, the Soviets knew it, and the conspiracy theory that claimed otherwise was, fittingly, a product of the very nation that had made the journey. The logical structure of the argument from Soviet silence is worth stating with precision, because it constitutes the most rigorous proof of the lunar landings available to anyone who was not personally present at mission control or on the lunar surface. The argument does not depend on trusting the United States. It does not depend on analyzing photographs. It does not depend on understanding the physics of shadows or the behavior of flags in a vacuum. It depends only on a single question about the behavior of the Soviet Union, and the answer to that question settles the matter. The question is this: if the Apollo landings had been faked, would the Soviet Union have known? And if it had known, would it have remained silent? The answer to the first part is unambiguous. The Soviet Union would have known. The Soviet Union possessed the most sophisticated space tracking network outside the United States. It tracked the missions in real time. It received the radio transmissions directly from the spacecraft. It measured the trajectory, the signal delay, and the direction of the source. A faked landing would have required transmitting from a terrestrial location, and the Soviet network would have detected that the transmissions were not coming from the moon. A faked landing would have required either no spacecraft on a lunar trajectory or a fraudulent one, and the Soviet network would have detected the discrepancy. There is no version of a faked landing that the Soviet tracking network would have failed to detect, because the technical means of detection were precisely the means the Soviet network possessed and was actively employing. The answer to the second part is equally unambiguous. If the Soviet Union had detected a fraud, it would not have remained silent. The Soviet Union was engaged in a global ideological and geopolitical struggle with the United States. It maintained one of the most aggressive propaganda operations in history. It exploited every American weakness and manufactured American weaknesses where none existed. The exposure of a faked moon landing would have been the single most valuable propaganda opportunity of the entire Cold War, an opportunity to demonstrate that the United States had perpetrated the greatest fraud in human history and to destroy American credibility across every front of the global competition. The Soviet Union would not have passed up such an opportunity. It would have seized it with overwhelming force, marshaling its tracking data and its scientific authority to expose the fraud before the entire world. The Soviet Union did not expose a fraud. Therefore, the Soviet Union did not detect a fraud. Therefore, no fraud existed. The logic is airtight, and it requires no trust in the United States whatsoever. It requires only the recognition that the Soviet Union was both capable of detecting a fraud and motivated to expose one, and that it did neither, which is explicable only if there was no fraud to detect. The silence of the most capable and most hostile observer is the proof. A guilty United States could have deceived its friends, its allies, and its own population. It could not have deceived the Soviet tracking network, and it could not have purchased the Soviet Union's silence, because the Soviet Union had nothing to gain from silence and everything to gain from exposure. The Soviet Union was silent because the Soviet Union, having looked, found nothing to expose. The opening of the Soviet archives after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided the final confirmation of this reasoning. The post-Soviet period made available the memoirs, the documents, and the testimony of the men who had run the Soviet space program, and none of this material contained any suggestion that the Soviet Union had ever doubted the reality of the American landings. The Soviet engineers, in their memoirs, treated Apollo as the genuine achievement that had defeated their own lunar program. The Soviet tracking data, where it has been described, confirmed the missions. The Soviet scientific analyses of the lunar samples, published in the open literature, confirmed their lunar origin. At no point in the vast outpouring of post-Soviet revelation, which exposed the Nedelin disaster, the N-1 failures, the deaths of cosmonauts, and the full catalog of Soviet space program secrets that the Soviet state had concealed for decades, Did any document or any witness suggest that the Soviet Union had believed the American landings to be faked? The Soviets had been willing, after 1991, to reveal their own catastrophic failures and their own deepest secrets. They revealed no doubt about Apollo, because they had never had any. This is the deepest irony of the entire subject. The opening of the Soviet archives revealed that the Soviet Union had lied about a great many things. It had lied about Nedelin for 29 years. It had lied about its lunar program for 30 years. It had concealed the deaths of its cosmonauts and the failures of its rockets. The Soviet state was demonstrated, by its own revealed records, to have been a prolific and sustained liar about its own space program. And this same lying state, this demonstrated concealer of inconvenient truths, never lied about the American moon landings, never claimed they were faked, and never doubted they were real. The most accomplished liar in the history of spaceflight told the truth about its rival's greatest achievement, because in this one case, the truth could not be hidden, and the lie could not be sustained. The Americans had gone to the moon, and even the Soviet Union could not pretend otherwise. There is a principle, recognized in law and in the evaluation of evidence generally, that the testimony of a hostile witness carries a particular weight that the testimony of a friendly witness cannot match. When a person testifies in favor of a conclusion that serves their own interest, their testimony is discounted because they have a motive to assert that conclusion, regardless of its truth. When a person testifies against their own interest, in favor of a conclusion that harms them, their testimony is credited because they have no motive to assert it except that it is true. A witness who confirms a fact that they desperately wished were false, that they were motivated to disprove, and that they had the means to disprove if it had been false, provides the strongest possible confirmation of that fact. This is the principle that makes the Soviet confirmation of the Apollo landings the definitive evidence of their authenticity. The American achievement of landing men on the moon was, in the summer of 1969, a claim made by the United States about itself. Considered in isolation, an American claim of American triumph might be regarded with the skepticism appropriate to any party's assertion of its own success. The United States had every motive to claim a lunar landing, whether or not one had occurred, because the propaganda value of the claim was enormous. If the only evidence for the lunar landing had been American testimony, a determined skeptic might have found room for doubt, not because the doubt was reasonable, but because the source was interested. But the lunar landing was not confirmed only by the United States. It was confirmed by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet confirmation transformed the evidentiary situation entirely. The Soviet Union was the hostile witness in its purest form. It was not a neutral party. It was not an ally inclined to support the American claim. It was the adversary that had been defeated by the American achievement, that had every motive to deny it, that had been humiliated by it, and that would have been vindicated by exposing it as a fraud. If any party on earth would have testified against the American claim, it was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, examining the evidence with the most sophisticated tracking network outside the United States, motivated beyond any other party to find a fraud, equipped beyond any other party to detect one, concluded that the American claim was true. The hostile witness, given every reason and every means to convict, acquitted. There is no stronger form of testimony. This transforms the meaning of the American achievement in a manner that should be understood and appreciated. The landing of Apollo 11 on the moon was not merely an American triumph asserted by Americans. It was an American triumph confirmed by America's mortal enemy, validated by the very nation that most wished to see it fail. The Soviet Union did not confirm the landing because it wanted to. It confirmed the landing because the evidence its own instruments gathered left it no honest alternative. The confirmation was extracted from the Soviet Union by physical reality, against the Soviet Union's every wish and interest. And a triumph confirmed by a hostile enemy, against that enemy's deepest desires, is a triumph established beyond the possibility of reasonable doubt. The principle extends beyond the specific question of the moon landing into a more general truth about how the most important facts come to be established. The facts that survive the scrutiny of those most motivated to deny them are the facts that can be trusted absolutely. A scientific finding that withstands the attacks of those who wished it were false is a finding established with particular firmness. A historical claim confirmed by the party it most embarrasses is a claim that can be relied upon. The Apollo landings belong to this category. They are not merely well documented, they are confirmed by the hostile testimony of the adversary that built an entire tracking network in part to monitor them, and that would have given a great deal to expose them as false. The landings passed the most demanding test that any factual claim can face. They were confirmed by their enemies. There is a final dimension to the enemy's testimony that elevates the American achievement rather than merely defending it. The Soviet confirmation of Apollo 11 was, in a sense, the Soviets would never have intended, the highest honor that could have been paid to the American accomplishment. The Soviet Union, having competed against the United States for 12 years, having matched and exceeded American achievements throughout the early space race, having staked its national prestige and its ideological credibility on the proposition that it could outperform the United States in space, was forced by physical reality to acknowledge that the Americans had done what the Soviets could not. The acknowledgement was not given in words of praise. It was given in the more eloquent form of an adversary's inability to deny what an adversary most wished to deny. The Soviet Union, by failing to expose a fraud that did not exist, testified to the reality of the American achievement more powerfully than any American celebration could. The enemy, who wanted the landing to be fake, confirmed it was real, and in that confirmation lay the final measure of what the United States had accomplished. The Americans had done something so undeniably real that even the nation most desperate to deny it could not. The complete body of evidence confirming the Apollo lunar landings, assembled from Soviet, American, and third-party sources across more than half a century, constitutes one of the most thoroughly verified factual claims in the history of human achievement. The evidence falls into several independent categories, each of which would be sufficient on its own to establish the reality of the landings, and which together render the conclusion inescapable. The Soviet tracking evidence constituted the first independent confirmation. The Soviet deep space network at Yevpatoria and the fleet of Soviet tracking ships monitored the Apollo 11 mission throughout its trajectory. The radio signals carrying the astronauts' voices arrived with a round-trip delay of approximately 2.5 seconds. The delay characteristic of a signal traveling to the moon and back across a distance of approximately 240,000 miles. The directional measurements traced the source of the signals to the moon, and the Soviet antennas followed the lunar motion as they tracked the transmissions. The trajectory measurements confirmed that the spacecraft followed the path of a genuine lunar mission through every phase. The Soviet network, motivated to find a fraud and equipped to detect one, found none. The laser retroreflector evidence provided permanent, physical, independently verifiable confirmation. The retroreflectors deployed by Apollo 11, Apollo 14, and Apollo 15 reflect laser beams fired from Earth directly back to their source. Observatories around the world, in many nations, have bounced lasers off these reflectors for more than 50 years. The reflectors sit at the precise locations of the landings. They could not exist there unless human-made objects had been placed on the lunar surface at those locations. The lunar laser ranging experiments continue to the present day, providing measurements of the Earth-Moon distance accurate to within millimeters, and confirming, with each measurement, the presence of the Apollo hardware on the Moon. The lunar sample evidence provided geochemical confirmation. The Apollo missions returned 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil. This material has been analyzed by laboratories in many nations. It exhibits characteristics impossible to produce on Earth, including formation in the complete absence of water, and isotope ratios reflecting billions of years of exposure to solar wind and cosmic radiation on an airless body. The Soviet Union, which possessed its own lunar samples returned by the robotic Luna probes, examined American samples and confirmed their lunar origin. The two nations exchanged samples, and Soviet scientists, comparing American material against genuine Soviet lunar material, published analyses confirming the American samples were authentic. The third-party confirmation accumulated in the decades after the landings as other nations developed the capability to observe the lunar surface. In 2009, the American Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographed the Apollo landing sites from lunar orbit at sufficient resolution to show the descent stages of the lunar modules, the scientific instruments left by the astronauts, and in some cases, the tracks left by the astronauts' footsteps and the lunar roving vehicles. These photographs were taken by an American spacecraft, but they were not the only ones. The Japanese lunar orbiter Kaguya, launched in 2007, gathered topographic data consistent with the Apollo photography. The Indian Chandrayaan missions observed the lunar surface. The Chinese Chang'e missions, conducted by a nation with no particular interest in supporting American claims, photographed the moon in detail. The landing sites are observable by any nation with a lunar orbiter, and the hardware left by the Apollo missions remains visible to modern instruments. The statistical record of the Apollo program itself underscores the scale of what was accomplished and the implausibility of faking it. 6 missions landed on the moon between 1969 and 1972. 12 astronauts walked on the lunar surface. The missions returned 382 kilograms of samples, deployed dozens of scientific instruments, and transmitted thousands of hours of television and voice communication. To fake this body of activity would have required fabricating the tracking data observed by the Soviet Union and other nations. Manufacturing 382 kilograms of false lunar material, convincing enough to deceive geochemists possessing genuine lunar samples, placing functioning laser retroreflectors on the actual lunar surface, and somehow ensuring that the Soviet Union, with every motive to expose the fraud, failed to detect any of it. The fabrication would have been more difficult than the actual achievement. The final accounting renders the conclusion with the certainty that the evidence demands. The Apollo landings were tracked by the Soviet Union. They were confirmed by Soviet measurements. They left physical hardware on the moon that is observable today by multiple nations. They returned samples whose lunar origin was confirmed by Soviet scientists, comparing them against Soviet lunar material. They were never disputed by the Soviet Union across more than 2 decades of continued Cold War hostility. The conspiracy theory that emerged in the United States in 1976 possessed none of this evidence and consisted entirely of misinterpreted photographs. The weight of the evidence is not merely heavy, it is overwhelming, and the heaviest single component of that weight is the confirmation provided by the adversary that most wished the landings had never happened. More than half a century has passed since the engineers at the Soviet tracking station in Yevpatoria sat before their consoles in the early hours of July 21, 1969, searching their data for the evidence of American fraud that their nation so desperately needed, and finding instead the confirmation they least wanted to find. In the decades since, the reality of the Apollo moon landings has been confirmed by an accumulation of evidence so vast and so varied that the question of their authenticity has long since ceased to be a serious question. The retroreflectors still reflect their lasers. The samples still reveal their lunar origin. The landing sites have been photographed by the spacecraft of multiple nations. And underlying all of this evidence, anchoring it, lies the single most powerful confirmation of all, the confirmation that came not from America's friends, but from America's enemy. The deepest meaning of the Soviet confirmation lies in what it reveals about the nature of truth and the conditions under which truth becomes undeniable. There are facts in this world that we accept on the testimony of those who share our interests, and there are facts that we accept on the testimony of those who oppose them. The first kind of fact always retains a residue of doubt because the witnesses had reasons to assert it beyond its truth. The second kind of fact achieves a certainty that the first kind can never reach, because the witnesses asserted it against their own interest, against their own desire, against everything they wished to be the case. The American moon landing belongs to the second category. It is not a fact that rests on the word of those who wanted it to be true. It is a fact that rests on the word of those who wanted, more than anything, for it to be false, and who confirmed it anyway because reality gave them no choice. There is an irony in the conspiracy theory that deserves a final reflection, because the theory does an injustice that extends beyond its insult to the American men and women who accomplished the landing. The conspiracy theory holds that the landing was faked, but for the landing to have been faked, the Soviet Union would have had to be either deceived or complicit. Either the Soviet tracking network failed to detect a fraud it was equipped and motivated to detect, which would make the Soviet scientists incompetent, or the Soviet Union detected the fraud and chose to conceal it, which would make the Soviet Union complicit in the greatest deception in history against its own interest. Neither possibility survives examination. The Soviet scientists were not incompetent. They tracked the missions accurately, and they knew the missions were real. And the Soviet Union was not complicit. It had no reason to conceal a fraud that would have handed it the propaganda victory of the century. The conspiracy theory insults not only the 400,000 Americans who built the Apollo program, it insults the Soviet engineers who honestly tracked the missions and honestly confirmed their reality. Men who, in this one instance, told the truth about their rival's achievement, when a lie would have served their nation better. The Apollo moon landing was the achievement of an industrial civilization operating at the peak of its capability, an achievement so real and so thoroughly accomplished that it could be confirmed by the very nation that had built an entire tracking network in the hope of one day surpassing it. 400,000 Americans built the machines, computed the trajectories, and managed the missions that carried 12 men to the surface of the moon. And when they had done it, the confirmation of their achievement came not only from their own celebration, but from the silent, reluctant, undeniable testimony of their enemy, the Soviet Union, which had wanted the landing to be fake, which had been equipped to prove it was fake, which had every reason in the world to expose it as fake, looked at the evidence its own instruments had gathered, and confirmed that it was real. There is no higher confirmation than that. The enemy who most wished to deny the American triumph became, against its own will, the witness who proved it beyond doubt. The men at Yevpatoria did their work honestly, and their honest work produced a conclusion that would outlast the Soviet Union itself. The nation that employed them no longer exists. The ideological competition that motivated their search for fraud ended with the dissolution of the state they served. But the conclusion their instruments forced upon them remains, as solid today as it was in the early hours of July 21, 1969. The Americans had gone to the moon. The enemy had confirmed it. And no theory advanced in the absence of evidence by people who possessed none of the tracking data the Soviets had gathered could ever overturn the verdict that America's own adversary had been compelled to render. If this account of how America's greatest enemy confirmed its greatest achievement brought you a new understanding of one of history's most important events, consider subscribing to Space Race Tales. Every week, we bring you the untold stories of the Cold War cosmos, the cosmonauts and astronauts who flew impossible missions, the engineers who built impossible machines, and the secrets that two superpowers spent decades hiding from the world. The space race did not end in 1972. The stories are only beginning to be told. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us for the next chapter.